This is the first Lockheed Constellation, and this is the last Lockheed Constellation. In between, 856 examples of this iconic airliner were built in Burbank, California. And we're now going to tell you this story in Celebrating Aviation with Mike Machat. But first, we have a very exciting offer to bring you from the very best of aviation publishing, Specialty Press. I've spoken to my dear friend Craig Cadera. He's a former Air Force pilot, former airline pilot, and my co-author, along with John Proctor, on From Props to Jets, which we wrote about 10 years ago. But Craig has a new book called America's Round Engine Airliners, Airframes and Power Plants in the Golden Age of Aviation. It's a stunning new book, and it tells you not only about the airplanes, but the engines that made these airplanes successful. We're bringing you an exclusive offer from Specialty. You can get this 10 by 10 hardbound book that is 216 pages with 300 beautiful color and black and white photos. And all you have to do is click on the link below and enter Mike in the coupon code on the checkout page, and you will get a 25% discount, and this book will be delivered right to your door. We'll have other Specialty Press books in future episodes, and we're very excited about this offer and very, very proud to be able to bring this to you. But now the story of the Lockheed Constellation. And no, I didn't put up the wrong slide. This is a Douglas DC-4, but it's a part of the story because it demonstrates the phrase that competition is a good thing and it makes both competitors better. And you'll see with every evolution of the Lockheed Connie, there was an equal evolution of the Douglas airliners from Santa Monica across town. And that is as big a part of the story as anything else. The DC-4 came from a military transport, the C-54 Skymaster. And just like that, the Constellation came from a military transport called the C-69. This was the Army Connie, a pressurized airplane from the very beginning. Its first flight was January 9th, 1943. You notice that the outer wing resembles the P-38 Lightning. The Connie was an evolution of the Model 44 Excalibur, which in itself was a development of the famed Lockheed twins. Here you see the Model 18 or the Lodestar. And what they did is they took the classic Lockheed twin tail, added a center fin, and now you've got one of the most iconic airliner designs of all time, the famous Constellation with its aquatic curved fuselage. The Connie was designed by Hal Hibbard, Willis Hawkins, and this gentleman, Kelly Johnson, a young rising star with the company who would go on to fame leading the Lockheed Skunk Works. Another individual that was really important in the development of the Connie was Howard Hughes. Hughes was the owner of TWA, and he was involved in the design from the very beginning. Here's a picture of Hughes coming down the stairs after a world record transcontinental flight on April 17th, 1944. Hughes flew the Connie along with TWA President Jack Fry from Burbank, California to Washington, D.C. in a record 6 hours and 57 minutes. It wowed the airline world and really put the airplane on the map. So I'll tell you what, here we are at LaGuardia. Let's climb aboard a Connie and I'll take you for a flight in this beautiful airplane. As we look out the windows, we see the power plants. These are 2,200 horsepower Curtiss Wright R3350 radials on the original models. And there were such features on TWA as sleeper service. They had a forward lounge on the early Connies. And here it is, the beginning, the model 049 pictured at Burbank. You see the Lockheed plant in the background. And this was an amazing airplane. It held between 44 and 64 passengers, depending on the configuration. It went into service with TWA in 1945. Cruise speed was about 300 miles per hour. The wingspan was 123 feet, which it was noted in ads of that day was 3 feet longer than the Wright brothers' original flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903. Max takeoff gross weight was 86,000 pounds, and the range was roughly 3,000 miles with a service ceiling of 25,000 feet. In 1948, the 749 model, and here we have a 749A, was the ultimate evolution of this model of the Connie. And passenger count was now up to 64 passengers. But it was a beautiful airplane, and this was the quintessential airliner competing with the Douglas DC-4 and the early DC-6. So let's look at some other carriers who operated the Connie. And I should mention that in 1953, it was edicted that all airliners would be painted white. This was a requirement that fulfilled two different requirements. The first is that the white paint reflected heat and kept the cabin of the airplane cooler on the ground. And second was a edict from the Department of Defense, which basically stated that they wanted the airliners to be identifiable for air defense aircraft going up on interceptions during the Cold War, to differentiate an airliner from supposedly a bare metal enemy bomber coming in over the North Pole. And so the white, what they call the white crown scheme, became the standby for all airline color schemes in the early 50s. So here you have a TWA Connie in this beautiful John Proctor photo at San Diego. A British Overseas Airways Corporation early Connie. Capital Airlines, very distinctive markings here. And here's how the Constellation looked in scale with the other airliners of its time. So you have a 749 model at the top, Douglas DC-6 in the center, Boeing Stratocruiser at the bottom. And I should mention that the 800 some Connies that were built were about half the number of the Douglas DC-4, 6, and 7 series, with 1,686 total built out of Santa Monica. And this is the heart of the airplane, the Curtiss-Wright R3350 radial engine. Here's an Eastern Connie, the Great Silver Fleet, as it was called. And you notice underneath the fuselage is a pod, and this is called a speed pack. This is basically an empty canoe, as you see it here, on 4 wheels, and it's filled with baggage and then towed under the airplane and winched up to the bottom of the fuselage to increase the baggage capacity. There was a military variant of the 749, and it's the WV-1 early warning Constellation. It has a radar antenna on the top and bottom. The top antenna is for altitude, bottom is for range. And this is the beginning of the electronic intercept and early warning type aircraft used by the Air Force and the Navy. A very successful airplane in its era. Here's the cockpit of the Connie, a 3-man flight crew. On international flights, they carried a navigator and also a radio operator. Got a little crowded up there, but it was the state of the art at that time. And here's a beautiful shot of the instrument panel. If those control wheels look familiar, those are literally out of a P-38. And this is, again, the early model 6 and 749 Connie. Right about that time, Douglas ups the ante with the DC-6B, called the Thoroughbred, probably one of the most successful piston-powered airliners. And so Lockheed answers the call with the Super Constellation. And this involved an 18-foot fuselage stretch. You see the square windows. And now the passenger capacity was up to 74 passengers. This is called the Super C Connie. The engines were uprated to 3,000 horsepower. Airplane had a cruise speed of 300 miles per hour. Max gross takeoff weight was now 125,000 pounds, and the range was just about 3,500 miles. But this became really the backbone of the Constellation fleet in the early 1950s. Not to be outdone, Douglas came up with the DC-7. And so Lockheed answered that challenge with the 1049G, called the Super G Connie, in 1955. And here we see a posed shot at Kansas City. You notice this airplane has the 600-gallon wingtip tanks, which were used mainly for the international routes, sometimes within the U.S. on staging flights when they'd move an airplane from the East Coast to the West Coast. But this became kind of the most popular, the most well-known version of the Connie. It was right about the time Disneyland opened. TWA was the official airline at Disneyland, and you'll see some models at the end of the program that depict this particular airplane. Passenger count was now up to 88, and the takeoff weight was 138,000 pounds. Cruise speed was up to 335 miles per hour. This was the fastest of the Connie family. And you want to talk about luxury? This is the first class lounge. Each 1049G had a hand-painted mural, as you see here above the windows in the first class lounge. And this is a ramp shot at LAX in the mid-50s. And it's a very profound photo in the sense that you see in the foreground a Super G awaiting its passengers. And taxiing away from the gate at left is a 749 Connie. And I mention this because the engines on the Super G were turbo compound. They were much more complex, more powerful, not as reliable as the simple 3350s that you see on the 749. And the point here is that the 749s flew well into the 1960s. The last flight of a Connie was Eastern Shuttle in 1968. But luxury was the name of the game. Here on this Eastern Super G, they coined the phrase Golden Falcon, all first class service, and they changed the red duck hawk and the meatball on the fuselage to a Golden Falcon emblem, as you see here. The G was just a beautiful airplane. Even on the ground, it just looked like it was doing 300 miles an hour. And this is one of my favorite color schemes of all time. But compare the commercial version with the military variant here. This is the EC-121, the military version of the Super G. And this is the radar Connie. The Navy had the WV-2 warning star. And again, these served as aerial pickets, early warning airplanes during the Cold War. Here we have the last in the 1049 series, the Model H, which was a convertible freighter. You notice the square propeller tips on this particular model. The photo was taken at Burbank. And this is a all freighter version. It's a converted Super C. But the Super Gs came into service in 1955. And then the final member of the Constellation family was the Starliner, the 1649 in 1957. TWA named them the Jetstream to convey speed. And in this outstanding ad by Ren Wicks, you notice the exaggerated wingspan, which was a personal request from Howard Hughes, as Wicks explained to me. And it's to convey the image of the engines being further outboard, which lowers vibration and noise in the cabin. And of course, the 150-foot wingspan. And here's the airliner flying out over Long Beach Harbor. And just an elegant airplane. It was a 2-foot fuselage stretch, but the wing was mounted a little further back than the G models, and the engines were considerably larger. The range on this airplane was 5,500 miles, and it was the really the true intercontinental airliner. It went into service in 57, but the advent of the jets just a year later gave this airplane a very short lifespan. Not to be outdone, and Douglas answered the call with their version of the ultimate DC-7, the DC-7C, which also had an extended wingspan, taller tail, lengthened fuselage, and extended fuel tanks, which gave it intercontinental range. But as good as these airplanes were, once the jets came in, they only lasted another 2 or 3 years in frontline service, and another few years after that. That was the end of the golden age of piston-powered air travel. What we see here is a 1649 Starliner on the ground after what became the longest piston-powered airline flight in history. This was TWA Flight 801, transpolar nonstop service from London to San Francisco. The airplane was bucking headwinds the whole way, but TWA was determined to claim the nonstop crown. And this airplane was in the air for 23 hours and 19 minutes. The flight took place on October 2nd, 1957. The 1649 had a stately cruise speed of 290 miles per hour, weighed 160,000 pounds at takeoff, and held up to 88 passengers. I thought I'd close with some models of the Connie. If you were interested in this airplane, these are original 1950s models that can be found on eBay or Model Swap Meet, or if you have a vintage model shop in town. They are obtainable, and they were re-released in other versions also, which might be easier to get. But Monogram had a beautiful Super G Connie. This build-up by Craig Cadera shows you the the amount of model that you could get for 98 cents back in 1955. But it has the floating stairs, the stewardesses at the top of each stairs, the tug. It was just a beautiful kit. In today's market, I think a good kit like this would be easily obtainable for probably $40 or $50. In buildable condition. Collector condition would be closer to 60, 75. And Revell had both the passenger and the military Connie that you see here. This is a build-up by my friend Jim Keeshan of the Super G. Beautiful kit. And this is the WV2 from my friend Jim John. And these are both Revell kits that just really represented the airplane. They were just easy to build and beautiful examples of the modeling art of the 1950s. And here's my final salute to the airplane. A picture called Evening Star, a Super G Connie coming down the ILS into Los Angeles in Christmas of 1956. And it's symbolic of the sunset of the golden age of piston-powered travel, because the next step for Lockheed was turboprop. This is the Electra taking off out of Burbank. And although Boeing, Douglas, and Convair went to pure jet airplanes with the 707, DC-8, and 880 respectively, Lockheed built the country's only 4-engine turboprop airliner, the Electra, and we'll be covering that airplane in a future episode. So there you have it, the story of the Lockheed Constellation. And thank you for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. As always, special thanks to Craig Cadera and Jeff Thomas for many of the images that you saw in this presentation. And I'd like to dedicate this program to the late John Proctor, dear friend, and he will always epitomize Transworld Airlines. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.